So thanks for coming to CrossingsCon. It's always lovely to see you all. And as a reminder, if you're enjoying the panel, we and the con in general, we're going to be in person again next summer in Montreal, and you can find more at crossingscon.org and register.crossingscon.org. And with that, I will let Isabel take it away.
Go. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel Sepúlveda. I am a recent graduate of Columbia University. I studied English and comparative ethnic studies. And sort of in my time at Columbia, I have done a lot of research into race and time travel fiction. It formed sort of that was my thesis for my race ethnicity studies major. And I am very excited to discuss the intersections of race and identity by way of Octavia Butler's Kindred. Maybe let's start. Can everyone who's read Kindred maybe raise their hand? I'm curious to see. Okay. Well, I'm very excited for all of you who have not read the book. This talk, I suppose, will be full of spoilers. So apologies in advance, but I still highly recommend it, obviously. I probably wouldn't have written a thesis on it if I hadn't. But to start, I want to just sort of talk generally about time travel. And I think to begin, I just want to maybe have a couple people come up and tell me what your favorite piece of time travel sort of based media is. It can be a book, it can be a podcast, it can be a movie, a TV show. Mine is probably Doctor Who, but I'm curious to see what you all are interested in. I think Emma said you all could come up to the panel and just share the podium, not panel.
There's a very good podcast called Ars Paradoxica.
I love.
And just they do time travel so well, and they think through the implications of it in a really interesting way. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I really like Ars Paradoxica too. Anyone else like to share?
So for me, there's some really good time travel fan fiction that I like. Specifically, there's two major ones that I really like. Both are Harry Potter fan fiction. There's Dead of Time by Shaylani, and there's also Of a Linear Circle, which I think is by Flamethrower. So that's cool. Yeah, I really like fanfic because then you can go back and kind of look at all the little clues that were in the story before that you just missed because you didn't know it was a time travel fanfic or something like that. So.
Yeah. No, there's a lot of rewatch value and reread value, whatever, to time travel, I think.
Yes.
And Harry Potter has a surprising amount of really good time travel fan fiction. Anyone else? Maybe one more person? Sarah.
Hello.
Hi.
So mine is a Korean drama called Signal, which is the cop show where the main character communicates with someone who's in the past and they work together to solve a crime.
Oh, that's
So it's not travel per se, but they are like their communication is traveling back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of there's some Western movies that also use it because they're communicating via I can't think of like they're not phones, walkie-talkies. In the 80s and one is in the 2000s.
Oh, yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for sharing. So as you can see, there is sort of a lot of different types of time travel, ways that you can define time travel. And, you know, I'm sure there's plenty more from movies and TV shows that you all, and fan fictions and books and all that you have read. I have another question that I'd like to hear a couple people answer. And it is, if you could travel anywhere in time, where would you go? Past, present, future, take your pick. I'm just curious. So,
Okay, so you say that and then I immediately get stumped and forget everywhere that I've ever wanted to go.
You're fine.
But
I think just pick your favorite period drama.
yeah. You know, a good Downton Abbey, high society, early 1900s is always fun. And since the Olympics are happening right now, I was just thinking it could be fun to go back in time to ancient Greece and see like the first big sporting events as something that like still affects people to this day.
Yeah, well, that's very cool. Six said in the chat that I'd go to the future because I'm curious how things will work out, which I think is a very valid answer. Anyone else?
We also got another one in the chat from Astral Depths, who has an entire time travel plan that involves going back in time, picking up Kellogg, and then going to the 90s and making him tour Cereal City. So that's exciting.
Oh, I love that. Wait, am I muted? Okay. Anyone else? Alrighty, that's okay. But I think, you know, just from those sort of couple questions, it pretty quickly becomes clear that there are a lot of different reasons why people are interested in time travel fiction and lots of different ways that you can tell a time travel story, which I think leads to the question, and I think will lead to me sharing my screen now. What is time travel? And, you know, okay. Someone just said, oh, these people, they were sending letters. And so they weren't traveling back and forth, but their communication was, their ideas, you know, their knowledge. But then you also have, you know, touring Kellogg around Cereal City, or taking someone from the past and bringing them into the future. So there are a lot of different ways that you can define time travel and that you can write time travel. I mean, I think the most basic question, are you going back into the past? Are you going into the future? Because those are two very different kinds of stories that you can tell. So this is a picture from an adaptation of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, which is pretty widely credited as the first sort of time travel novel, or novella in this case. It tells the story of a man called the Time Traveler who gets in his little time travel machine and goes into the future and meets these two races whose names are escaping me at the moment. And he sort of sees them as like evolved humans, and There are some sort of interesting, from the very beginning, racial undertones in the book in the way these two races are characterized, one being darker and seen as more sort of animalistic and brutal, and one being seen as whiter, lighter, and sort of more innocent and victimized by the sort of darker races. But yes, so this is sort of seen as the first time travel novel, but that leads, I think, to a lot of questions. H.G. Wells is pretty unanimously considered to have invented the time machine. The time machine novella is the first book to sort of suggest that, moving through time with some mechanical device. But is that the first time travel story? Do you need a time machine to travel in time? Do you need a TARDIS, or is it maybe something that just happens to you, as in Kindred? We never have a time machine in Octavia Butler's novel. The main character moves throughout time by mechanism that she never really comes to understand. So does that make it not a time travel story? Think about, stories where characters fall asleep for long periods of time, like Rip Van Winkle, or stories that maybe aren't time travel but are written non-linearly. Does that count as a kind of time travel? And how might these definitions exclude certain narratives or voices from the conversations we're having about time travel? For example, when I was working on my research for my thesis, I was sort of looking at a lot of different time travel novels written by non-white authors. And I was looking, just to see, big Latinx authors just in general in the science fiction genre. And it was really hard to find books that were sort of classified as science fiction written by Latin American sci-fi writers, or like Latino or Latin American Latinx science fiction writers, because a lot of them are classified under magical realism instead. So how does that change the conversations we're having if we, consider a story that might be defined as magical realism time travel? Okay. This is a really kind of dense but interesting sort of theorization about why we write these different kinds of time travel fictions. And this scholar, David Wittenberg, whose book I'm taking this quote from, suggests that time travel fiction is a sort of laboratory that you can use to question the most basic devices of storytelling, time, because stories are about actions that occur within time. And they sort of, within themselves, are theorizing how we as humans experience time, because even though time moves forward in a linear fashion, we don't really experience it that way. We think to our future, what we're doing tomorrow, or where we want to be in 5 years or 10 or 20 years. We think about the past. We, joke around with our friends, reminisce about our childhoods. We speculate about, what might have happened. So we don't really experience time linearly as human beings. So Wittenberg is kind of arguing here that time travel allows us to sort of make that literal. And that's something that I find a lot in Octavia Butler's text and will come up throughout this presentation. So the next question that I want to ask while we're still sort of talking about time travel in general is, who gets to travel in time? If you're going back to, your favorite period drama, back in the 1800s, people of color might have been enslaved or, sent to reservations. There's a sort of fraught history with marginalized groups traveling back to the past because it's a past that has been oppressive. So I just pulled here some famous time travelers. We've got Marty McFly. We've got Phil Connors from Groundhog Day. We've got all of the doctors, the Terminator, Bill and Ted. Surprising amount of 80s movies. But, these are some of the most iconic images of time travel and the stories that are getting retold and rebooted or reincarnated, as we see in the Doctor, for new generations. And these time travel stories, while they're really fun and we enjoy them, are not sort of engaging with time and humans' perception with it. There are more ways to think about that. And so that brings us to Kindred, which has a very different sort of view on time travel. One thing I found interesting while doing research is a lot of, the Doctor Who's and the Back to the Futures are sort of very much like adventure movies. They aren't really trying to ask more deep questions about, the nature of time or history. It's a lot about, temporal paradoxes. What would happen if you killed your own grandfather? And Kindred is, as a novel, sort of less interested in that. Kindred is about was published by Octavia E. Butler, a Black feminist science fiction writer in 1979. And it tells the story of Dana, a 26-year-old Black woman who has recently married a white man named Kevin, who gets pulled back in time to save the life of her white ancestor in the antebellum South, a man named Rufus. She sort of first meets him as a young child and then sort of watches him grow into an adult man who has been twisted by the sort of societal pressures of the antebellum South and the structures of white supremacy in the United States to from the sort of young child she first has met. And at certain points, she brings her husband, Kevin, back with her in time. And she lives as a slave on her family's plantation because she can only return to her present when she feels like her life is in danger. And so this is a quote from an interview Octavia Butler did, where she talks about the impulse for writing Kindred. And she says, she's talking about a man that she heard in college who was talking about, his parents and said, I'd like to kill all these old people who have been holding us back for so long. Because I can't, because I'd have to start with my own parents. When he said us, he meant Black people. When he said old people, he meant older Black people. That was actually the germ of the idea for Kindred. I've carried that comment with me for 30 years. He felt so strongly ashamed of what the older generation had to do without really putting it into the context of being necessary, not only for their lives, but his as well. And I think you really see that within Kindred. Dana has to make some very difficult decisions in her time on the plantation that her ancestor owns, because she needs to ensure her own birth, essentially. And she is forced to both witness and endure what these older generations had to do in order for her to survive. And so that kind of goes back to the idea David Wittenberg was talking about, that we can use time travel to sort of literalize these sort of thematic or philosophical ideas about ourselves and our communities. And Octavia Butler does that in Kindred, sort of pulling from this idea of what Black Americans have had to do to survive. So moving into Kindred, I sort of have three strands of time travel that I kind of want to pick at and discuss with you all. And they're listed here. First is that time travel in Kindred acts as a way for Octavia Butler to articulate the Black lives of enslaved Black Americans and their descendants that have been erased by the American Historical Archive. The second is that time travel sort of literalizes the experience of slavery on Dana as she is pulled back in time by refusing to allow her to die. Every time she feels as though she has experienced something that will no longer let her continue to live in the time of slavery, she is returned to the present and allowed to heal before she's almost immediately pulled back again to save her ancestor over and over. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. And then finally, though Kindred is very interested in the past, I also want to look a little bit about what it has to say about the future. And so I'll do that by exploring sort of Dana's relationship with her husband and how Octavia Butler uses that to explore what the future of Black-white racial relations in the United States might look like, and how to make them more equal through sort of reciprocal networks of care and consensual love that is founded on the acknowledgement of this history that has been erased. So before we get into that, I would like to mention that this novel deals with some pretty heavy subjects, including rape, suicide, physical violence, racism, and so on. If these subjects are triggering to you, I encourage you to step away if needed or mute this discussion. Please take care of yourself. I know that these can be difficult topics to discuss, and your mental health sort of matters first and foremost. So to start, I want to talk about Afrofuturism, which many of you have probably heard of, but I want, we'll make sure we're all on the same page. So an article that is pretty foundational in Afrofuturism as a field by Codwell Ashun says that Afrofuturism can be characterized as a program for recovering the histories of counterfutures. That's a lot of academic jargon, but basically what he's trying to argue is that Afrofuturism can be defined as looking to texts by authors like Octavia Butler and Samuel Delany and authors of today and seeing how they imagine the future via speculative fiction and technology that has been created in a time that has been hostile to creation of any sort of artistic expression by people of the African diaspora. And Octavia Butler's work, especially in her parables duology, is sort of one of the foundational texts of Afrofuturist fiction. But I argue that Kindred is as well, despite being very much about the past and not the future. So now I'm going to talk about how Kindred talks about history by using time travel. So at the end of the novel, this is a very long quote, but to summarize, Kevin and Dana are going back in the present to the plantation where it is in the 1970s. And they're looking for sort of any records of the people they have come to know, the slaves, the Whalen family, the family that owned them. And at the end of the novel, Kevin says, "You found no records. You'll probably never know what happened to them." And then Dana asks him, kind of upset with herself, "Why did I even want to come here? You'd think I would have had enough of the past." "You probably needed to come for the same reason I did," he shrugged, "to try to understand, to touch solid evidence that those people existed, to reassure yourself that you're sane." Essentially, they go back to this library trying to find records, and they find one obituary and a record of sale for some of, but not all of, the enslaved people that Dana and Kevin have befriended. And so in this sort of final moment, Kindred is essentially justifying itself as a text. It's using time travel to construct a fictionalized experience of slavery that is based heavily upon the accounts we do have, of which there aren't many, because those records weren't kept. Enslaved people weren't considered people. They were considered property and sold. And so Kindred, in this way, uses time travel as a way to recover and reconstruct a history that has otherwise been lost to time and oppression. And Judith Butler's work, Precarious Life, sort of talks about this concept of grievability. And she is talking here about people who cannot be mourned because they were already lost, or rather never were. They were never seen as people by the sort of general public, by, you know, the newspapers, the media, the way that people talk to one another. And because Black Americans were sort of seen as objects and their deaths were not recorded, they can't be grieved until they're sort of remembered. So Kindred, in this way, also allows these people, you know, gives, though Dana does not know how they died, she still can grieve them because she knew them as people and knew that they lived. She says early on in the novel to Rufus, "Don't go getting the idea that I'm a ghost. There are no ghosts." Which sort of sums up both her engagement with history. She doesn't see it as it haunting her. She sees it as something that she engages with. But it is also something that is deeply traumatizing. Here I move to my other favorite piece of time travel media, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. It is, for those who have not read the novel, it is about a sort of semi-fictionalized novel about Kurt Vonnegut's experiences during World War II, and through the point of view of the protagonist Billy Pilgrim, who has become unstuck in time due to his experiences during the war. And Kurt Vonnegut basically says early on in his novel that the novel is so short because there's really nothing to say about a massacre, an atrocity, because everyone is supposed to be dead. Dana and Kevin, as we see sort of throughout the novel, sort of begin as spectators who feel like they never have anything to say about the atrocities that they're witnessing because they, as we see here, never forgot they were acting, never really got into their roles. But then by the time the novel ends, as we see in that last bolded quote there, Dana doesn't have that distance anymore. The time travel has sort of allowed her to fully experience the history of enslavement that her ancestors, who she is living among, faced. And she's not acting anymore. She can't. She's sort of interacted with it too much. And it is because Octavia Butler is using a time travel novel, not just having Dana read through old journals or, you know, read a story that someone had written, but actually live it, that she is sort of able to literalize this experience. Afrofuturism, as Ishun describes it, stages a series of returns to the trauma of slavery through a temporal switchback, which is pretty much what Kindred is, rather literally, and it allows Octavia Butler to explore that experience. And in doing so, she creates this alternative archive of the Black American history within the novel itself. Queer theory is sort of full of this idea of alternative archives, but it also shows up a lot in both critical race theory and post-colonial theory. Sort of this idea that we have these archives that have not entered our official historical record, but are telling some kind of history, which Kindred is, sort of history mixed with fiction. So now we move into away from sort of why Kindred is a time travel novel and into what time travel in Kindred kind of does and is trying to say and how it operates. So this is the first panel in the Kindred graphic novel that came out in 2016. I highly recommend it. It is an incredible adaptation of the novel, which I think can be kind of difficult to adapt. I can't really imagine a Kindred movie, but the graphic novel does a fantastic job. And you see that the very first line of the novel is Dana telling the reader that I lost my arm on my last trip home. And she's in the hospital because somehow her trip to the past has very literally caused her arm to be severed from her body. And in an interview, Octavia Butler sort of talked about why she had Dana lose an arm. She says, I couldn't let her come back whole. Antebellum slavery didn't leave people quite whole. And so she had to literalize the experience by this debilitation, which is the opening of the novel. And as such, kind of puts the focus on how slavery causes disability to the people who are enslaved. And this sort of brought me to this concept of slow death by the recently deceased scholar Lauren Berlant, who writes in her book Cruel Optimism, which I pulled a quote from here, that slow death is not about sort of traumatic events per se, but in these sort of between moments, these acts of ordinariness where you're just kind of getting by day to day and slowly being ground down by your surroundings. And Kindred, throughout the novel, shows that slavery, while it is an incredibly violent system and a system that uses violence as a means of control, is not made of violence all the time. Dana tells Kevin, you don't have to beat people to treat them brutally. After Rufus rapes a Black woman and sort of forces her to have a relationship with him, her name is Alice, and she is Dana's great-great-grandmother. It says she went to him. Alice adjusted, became a quieter, more subdued person. She didn't kill him, but she seemed to die a little. So a part of her has been killed by the violence of slavery. And as you see, it kind of slowly wears these people, Dana's friends, away. And the time travel itself also acts in a similar way. I think a really good example of this is two scenes of rather intense violence in the novel, in which Dana is whipped. The first we have here, the whip burned like a hot iron across my back. I couldn't have gotten up at gunpoint, and she is returned to the present to heal because she thinks she's going to die in that moment. But then later on in the novel, the next time Dana goes back to the past, he beat me until I tried to make myself believe he was going to kill me. But it doesn't work because she has lived through it and she knows that she can survive. So she doesn't return to the present in this case and spend several more months stuck in the past because she has sort of learned to deal with this treatment. It's become part of almost her normal. And as such, we see sort of the forces of slow death are also operating within time travel. And then sort of to just touch briefly on these acts of violence that I have mentioned and how sort of they're used within Butler's texts, I turn to the work of Jasbir Puar, who is a scholar down at Rutgers, and she writes that maiming is a source of value extraction for populations that would otherwise be disposable. And sort of parsing the academic jargon, she basically argues that the state, in this case, sort of the Wayland plantation, which acts as a kind of synecdoche for the antebellum South as a whole, uses acts of violence in order to control the behavior of the enslaved people that are working for them in order to continue using their labor to make money. And you see this throughout the novel, that there are times when the characters, specifically there's a man who runs away with a woman that is an enslaved woman who, Alice, no, actually, sorry, I got that switched. Alice, who is a free Black woman, runs away with an enslaved man, and they're both caught. And Alice is enslaved by Rufus, and the man she ran away with has his ears cut off as a sort of essentially an example to those he might meet, that, you know, and to him, he himself, that he should not run away again, because the state has control of his body and will brutalize it if he sort of steps out of line. And so in this way, you see how maiming allows the conditions of slow death to slowly wear away the people subjected to it. And the interesting thing about Kindred is that because it is a time travel novel, we can sort of see within the parallels that Butler draws between past and present, the ways in which the state uses violence today, in this case in the 1970s, but you can, you know, think about recent police shootings as a way to sort of police behavior and continue to oppress Black Americans. Here you see in the first bullet point a story that Dana tells to Kevin about a time when her mother's car got stopped in a rich neighborhood, and 3 people called the police on her while she was waiting for someone to come help her fix her car. Suspicious character. 5'3" she was, about 100 pounds, real dangerous. The next bullet point is Dana sort of talking about South Africa. So we see an even sort of global racial perspective within the novel. And Dana sort of mentions that South African whites had always struck me as people who would have been happier living in the 19th century or the 18th. In fact, they were living in the past as far as their race relations went. They lived in ease and comfort, supported by huge numbers of Blacks, and they kept in poverty and held in contempt. Tom Leyland would have felt right at home. And it is because, you know, there are people, Black South Africans are rioting and dying because of the police, who are set to maintain the white supremacist government, have been told to. And that is how they maintain this system that is so similar to chattel slavery in America. And now I'm going to wrap up real quick and just talk a bit about how Kindred sees the future. Afrofuturism sort of talks a lot, Afrofuturist theory and Afrofuturist novels are very focused on the future, it's in the name, because of the power future has. There's a power in being able to envision a future. You can't create a future without racism if you can't imagine what that looks like. So envisioning a future is a very powerful thing. And I argue that Kindred is sort of envisioning a future that is reshaped around the needs of internalized, embodied political protest that's discussed by Joanna Hedva in their article on Sick Woman Theory, which I highly recommend. It talks about disability and disabled existence and disabled protest in very interesting ways that I think a lot of people who are interested in science fiction would also be interested in. And I also think that Butler's future constitutes a little bit of what Leah Piepzna Samarasinha talks about in her book Care Work, where she talks about how our lives are maintained by complex, non-monetary economies of care. You know, it's your friend who picks you up to run you to the grocery store when your car is broken down, or you know, you cook dinner for a friend who has recently had a family member passed away. And so we take care of each other, not because we're getting money for it, but because that is how we survive, live, and thrive. And you see that in this very tender scene between Kevin and Dana, sort of in the middle of the novel, They've reunited after Kevin accidentally gets stuck in the past for 5 years. And she basically asks him, like, please come with me. I'd like to have sex, to reconnect. And he says, no, I can't do it. I'll hurt you. And she says, no, this is what I want. Please come with me. He did. He was so fearful of hurting me. He did hurt me, of course. I had known he would, but it didn't matter. This moment really strikes me for a number of reasons, but it strikes me because there's a lot of very explicit consent here. Kevin wants Dana to sort of consent to him taking care of her. We also have this notion of hurt. She sort of says, I had known he'd hurt me, but it didn't matter. And we see throughout the novel these moments of Kevin being pretty oblivious to Dana in ways that are very hurtful. And they're very often paralleled with Rufus and Alice, the Black woman that he rapes. And they're trying to sort of draw comparison between the two. Kevin is often sort of shown as looking similar and sometimes acting or speaking similarly to Rufus as well. But ultimately, we see the difference between them because, Kevin shows a willingness to grow and learn and change. He is, I use the word infected here, but I don't think that's exactly the right word. But he is definitely shaped by his past, but he listens to Dana. He sort of has become aware of, what the heaviness of the history and the dynamics between Black and white couples in America, and sort of listens to her in a way to make a more equal relationship between the two of them. And this is another sort of quote from Hedva's piece, that the most anti-capitalist protest is to care for one another and to care for yourself. And that is sort of the future that Butler posits. It's not an easy one to get to. Kevin, throughout the novel says pretty awful things, and he ends the book not quite really understanding Dana's point of view, but the possibility you see is there for something more equal and fueled by care and love between them. So finally, the question that I ask myself often, why does this even matter? It goes back to something that I sort of touched on a little bit earlier, but this concept of visionary fiction by Walida Imarisha is one that I find very inspiring. Visionary fiction encompasses science fiction, fantasy, horror, magic realism, alternative timelines, and more. It is fantastical literature that helps us to understand existing power dynamics and helps us imagine paths to creating more just futures. And I see that in Kindred. And Kindred's message, though it was published 30 years ago, still rings hauntingly true today. I think awareness of anti-Black racism and racism in general in America has, improved, but there are still police shootings. There is still disparities in healthcare, in employment, in pay, and so on. And we still need messages like Kindred in order to help us imagine paths to creating more just futures. But as Kindred suggests, sometimes we also need time travel to do that, because so much of our past has been lost to history, that sometimes you need a little bit of fiction in order to recreate that archive and imagine a future. And I just like to end with a little video of someone else talking. This is N.K. Jemisin's 2018 Hugo Best Novel Acceptance speech. It's around 5 minutes, and it's just wonderful, and I hope you all enjoy. And I hope you all, let me know if they can't hear it. Okay, never mind. We can just move on to questions. I don't know how to make the screen share work, but okay. Anyway, that is my spiel. I hope you all enjoyed. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
What are some other books that you recommend that would be similar to Kindred in like Afrofuturist and or other books that talk about specifically race in time travel fiction?
A couple that I've read that I would highly recommend. One is a novella by Ken Liu that I believe you can get. There's a PDF online, but is also included in his paper menagerie collection. It's called The Man Who Ended History, a documentary, and it is about it's told in the format of a documentary, which is really cool. And it is about a historian whose wife is a physicist who basically discovers a way you can go back and rewatch any moment in history. But once you do, it's gone forever. You can never sort of go back to that moment again. And he sort of uses that to advocate for the survivors and family members of the Unit, say 741 experiments done by Japanese soldiers during World War II. It's just a really interesting sort of conversation about history and how we talk about history, and how we talk about, cultural atrocities. There are people in the documentary like, we just need to move on, or, Japan shouldn't apologize, or this didn't really happen. And it just feels very fresh into the current moment. Another book that I recommend slightly less, but is still interesting, is Sherman Alexie's Flight. I'm not a big fan of Sherman Alexie, but the book is about an Indigenous boy who travels back to several sort of significant moments in time. It's interesting. I don't know if I agree with all of what he has to say, but nonetheless, I think he's got some interesting points. Oh, yes, I can do that. Any other questions? Those are my two biggest recommendations.
Hi, yeah, thanks for a really cool presentation.
Thank you.
I had a question about a car. Well, I don't know if it's as much a question as can you elaborate on it. A comment you made early on about lots of things that might otherwise be classified as time travel works by authors of color being classified as magical realism. That really interesting. My senior spring undergrad, I took a course on the Gullah Geechee, who are descendants of enslaved people on like the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina. And I was with them because they have a very different, I'm certainly not the person to explain their concept of time to everybody, but they have a different concept of time than like our typical American Western. And we watched this movie called Daughters of the Dust that took place non-linearly and had a character who was like an unborn child, but you don't realize until the end of the movie that she hasn't been born yet. And like I'm seeing that I had kind of been seeing that as magical realism, but yeah, it may well be time travel. And I'm just curious if you wanted to talk more about that or have some examples of things that could be time travel that we don't typically think of as time travel.
No, that's a really good question. It's something I've thought of a lot. I'm not sure if it's, I'm not quite sure how people sort of classify it by genre, but I think the end of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, is actually a really interesting point. It's like, it's been so long since I read it. Give me 1 second. But it's like this aunt and her nephew sort of consummate their relationship. And then there's this sort of big like crowd of ants that comes and like eats them. And it's discovered that this was all written down at the very beginning of the book by this like random character, and it's all been predicted. And I think that's an example of maybe not necessarily time travel, but ways in which magical realism and time travel tend to overlap. And I think can make sort of trying to define things by genre very difficult, because in magical realism, time is very fluid and sort of operates differently. But depending on your definition of time travel or speculative fiction, you may or may not consider it within the genre. I think it really depends. I haven't quite decided how I feel about it yet. I just think it makes it hard if, someone who is looking for like science fiction or science fiction studies, I think maybe is excluding a lot of really interesting conversations about time and how we experience it by not considering those authors and those works. Any other questions?
Okay, not exactly a question, more of a comment in a way to be annoying. But I just, your comment about Sherman Alexie fiction and like Indigenous history reminded me of a book that I would recommend, and I'm just saying it publicly so that people can hear as well. It's called 150 Years Retold, and it is a graphic novel history, like Indigenous history of what is now Canada. And it does involve at the end a kind of time travel aspect, where a Indigenous like young person from the future, stories that they have told in the book, before going back to her present, which is our future. Which was very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's.
So I don't know if that's one that you've heard of.
I've not. Another thing I find really interesting, and it kind of goes back to Emma P's question about magical realism, is there's this sort of tradition in Indigenous sort of fiction and speculative fiction of Indigenous slipstream, which is like a sort of meshing of times and timelines in really interesting ways. Grace Dillon's anthology Walking the Clouds is an anthology of Indigenous speculative fiction, sort of has a section on it. Sort of maybe suggests that there are lots of different sort of traditions and ways of looking at time that might not, I don't want to say might not mesh with the way that the dominant fear, but might not, that differ significantly from the time travel sort of stories that have been popular in the past.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. All right, I'm back. So yeah, thank you all so much for coming. If there are no more questions, I'm guessing Isabel is willing to hang around for a little while longer if anyone wants to come up and ask something of them privately, or in a smaller group setting. And if you have other messages, we can also pass information along. Otherwise, thank you all again. Thank you, Isabel, so much for the presentation. It was super interesting. And I tried to keep notes of some of the books that you mentioned and recommended, to add to the ongoing con list of suggested books. So I might hit you up for some titles
Anytime.
as well. And I don't know that I've shared that, but somewhere we will share a collaborative list of all of the books folks have talked about over the last several days.
Exciting.
Yeah, so thank you all again. And if you want to come to our in-person con next year, you can find information in the main room or online. Thanks again.
Thank you all for listening.